Surinder.
Sure. Thanks, Alim. So this session is around how to develop and promote an effective service catalogue. I think it's easy to just roll out a service catalogue. The hard part comes when you have to develop something which is in effect effective, because I've been in organisations where there's been an Excel spreadsheet as a catalogue, and it's not always, the best way to deliver a service. So I'm going to try and keep it quite succinct, though again it's so vast and it's so hard to keep this topic quite short and sweet, but I'll try my best. So any questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So first of all, I'm not sure how many of you are actually familiar with a service catalogue, but I'm going to give you an ITIL definition of what a service catalogue is. The actual catalogue, this part of ITIL is the only thing that a customer actually sees, as in the end customer, because it's published to the end user, for the likes of you and I to, as a customer, to order something from a service catalogue. And we were discussing before the call how, you can envisage or think of the Argos catalogue or having an Amazon type of experience. So my kind of focus is on how to best educate everyone on what a service catalogue actually delivers from a customer perspective and a business perspective, but focusing on what the actual outcome is. So a service catalogue is the only part of the ITIL service portfolio that's published to the end user, the customer, and it supports the sale and delivery of IT services. In that, it all includes the deliverables, the prices, the contract points, ordering and request processes. One thing I'd like to say here is, it just doesn't have the request management aspect to it. It's also the bigger thing, which I see is the request fulfillment of a catalogue item, whatever that is, because each item has a request fulfillment process. Okay, moving on. These are example elements of a service catalogue. So this is what you would have in a service catalogue. Again, I'm just going to skim over this. Please feel free to ask a question if you would like me to go into further detail, but a brief description of what it is in layman's terms. We're not going into technical jargon here. If it's a mouse, just what kind of a mouse it is. And I know Bluetooth mouse is something I've had on a service catalogue before. Service level is actually one of my keen interests, because I like to work around performance as well. So having agreed service levels with the client or the customer and having them in the service catalogue, agreeing those contractually is how I've done it in my previous roles. Making sure the SLM supports the catalogue functionality. So performance reports are obviously going to impact the penalties that we were given as a business. So there's something to bear in mind in terms of how you set that up. There are 101 ways to skin a cat in terms of a service catalogue, and there's no, I don't think there's no right or wrong way to do it, but I think understanding what the dynamics are in terms of what the business wants, what the end user wants, engaging with the business and the client. I had multi-vendor approach to this as part of a sign transition network, so it was quite challenging. But again, SLM, service levels, SLAs are just a whole kind of beast to tackle on their own. Again, happy to dive into more detail around those if need be. The other thing is support. How is that request being supported? Again, contractually, there's SLAs around that, so it's entirely dependent on what your client is asking for. Again, service conditions, that's the maintenance around and what the change windows or change frames are in terms of your change management process. Cost, each service catalogue has a cost, and some may not have a cost, but obviously that goes in as nil into a catalogue, but there is a cost associated with most catalogue items. Again, goes back to the contract and what the customer has agreed with. I had to go back and forth with procurement within businesses to establish cost as well. So there's a lot of comms that go back and forth between the business and the client, or even the other vendors, in terms of agreeing a price on it. And sometimes it's not a fixed price, and there's the whole dynamics there. Again, massive topics and subjects to cover, but I'll crack on. Features and functions, and what value what value they actually bring to the customer and the catalogue as a whole. And lastly, related services, linking into other parts of the service catalogue and providing perhaps other services as well. I'll go into a bit more detail as I go on that last point, as I go on to the other slides. So I think these are the kind of core example elements of a service catalogue that I would cover. There's a whole host that you could have additional to this, but they're kind of the core ones. Okay, so I want you to all imagine this, because this is the best and simple way I've always kind of taken it to my client. It's just a shirt. And the shirt is actually the platform in or the tool set in my head. So I have Remedy or ServiceNow, which most of you are probably familiar with. So the question here is, what value does a customer look to gain from a service catalog? So why does a customer need a service catalog? And what are they trying to get out of it? So I'm going to use ServiceNow as a platform here, or the tool set, because ServiceNow is what most businesses are using. So they're going from Remedy to ServiceNow, for example. So this is what I did in my last transition. So one customer, is looking for price, size, color, and how good it is to wash, and whether it's, fantastic after its first wash as it was before the wash. Customer B is looking for the size, the color, and how well stitched it is, and whether it's 100% cotton. Now, they are the same thing, but the actual usage or the utilization of it is very different in terms of how the customer wants to see it. Customer A is probably not bothered about it being 100% cotton, but still it's delivering functionality which is tailored to the customer. This brings me onto a point where I had to go into a really convoluted process of creating an Amazon type experience for my customer, and that was further kind of broken down by the estates the customer had, and there were 90. So 45 of those estates were a customer A and 45 were a customer B, and all of it was coming off the same platform. So it's the same shirt, but it's being kind of seen in a different way. So there was, who sees what as well is a big thing when actually developing a catalogue, or even sitting down to talk about what the actual outcomes would be. So the customer, as I've picked 5 points here that have kind of sprung to mind, from various catalogues that I've set up. It meets the customer's budget. It meets the customer's needs. It fits the customer's budget. It's good value for money. That's something which I learned as I went on, how to kind of streamline things in a catalogue as well, because with experience, you become wiser as to how it can be done. And again, that goes to my point about processes from Monday as well, when I was talking about designing. Having had the exposure to catalogue request management and fulfillment processes, I was able to then work out what was good value for money for the customer. So as a catalogue designer, I think that was a big thing for me, like saving money. And you can actually save millions if you kind of know what you're delivering to the customer, to their spec, because a lot of it's bespoke. Amazon type of experience is not something what every customer I've worked with would want, but this one definitely did, and that I had to kind of go in and look at what I could do in terms of doing the good value for money aspect to it, making sure it's lasting quality, though it's it's quite dynamic, it's fluid, it changes as it goes on, it evolves. I think producing that initial good quality catalogue, you know, you'll see when it goes into operations and when it goes live, it's delivering, and you're not getting those penalty points because, you know, you've developed something that's going to potentially just have minor tweaks here and there, and guaranteeing, okay guys, I'm delivering this to you and it's going to do, you know, what you've asked me for it to do. So these are the 5 points which I think are fairly important in terms of how you deliver to the customer's needs. Okay, cracking on to the next slide. This is basically a view I just wanted you guys to see, those of you who haven't, but I'm sure most of you have. This is just kind of broken up. It's just one level view. There are many, and I just thought this one looked quite easy. It's kind of got a lot on it as well. So user accounts, how to create an account, how to create an account for a new user and get access for that new user, for example, could be one. So user accounts and access, and that there'd be various other nav categories and navigation categories under that. I would take it. You know, there's software and applications, for example. I'll go into a bit more detail further on into how software and applications was a thing which was automated as part of a catalogue. So this is kind of just a view that I wanted to share, and I thought it looked pretty good, and it had quite you know, a good number of services on there. So next slide. Okay, this is a ServiceNow kind of request form. It's got the outdated BlackBerry wireless device on it. So this is what you would see as a user if you had to go into a service catalog and potentially order something. So again, I'm just giving you a flavor of what it could look like. ServiceNow and Remedy are the two tool sets I've used a lot. I've actually also used another kind of front end SharePoint type of tool portal, which was developed by an American, and it's called Kinetic, and you can have various other types of functionalities in terms of what the user sees and what your actual back end is. So I'm not going to get into that because that's just you know, a way you can do it, and there's like I said, there's multiple ways to do this, but I've had exposure to a lot. So and I've actually developed a ServiceNow catalog which uses ServiceNow end to end. So there's that as well. So this is potentially, you know, what it could look like, entirely dependent again on what the customer or the client is asking for. Okay, so it's very important. It goes back to my behavior question and answers on Monday around how you know, how you go about asking those questions and asking the right questions, making use of the time that you have with the client at the workshops or focus groups that I had, you know, taking it to the customer and saying, look guys, this is what it is. So that comes after, but before we even start that, who is your customer, and you know, what are the most important business processes? Because I feel if we're familiar with what the actual business processes are, then, you know, we can map the catalog in a streamlined fashion. So that's a really key aspect as well. Are your services mapped to these business processes? Are your services currently defined? Do you have service level agreements? Again, very important, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so involving the customer is really important because you don't want to deliver something to a potential client and not be fit for purpose. So talk to the customer, make sure you equate the definition to the business value, important aspect. And I've made sure I've done that every time I've actually even thought of deploying a catalog. You can utilize existing information. So I've used a lift and shift approach as well, where I've used I've delivered a catalog in an organization and then just taken that design to another organization because it's basically what the customer wants. No need to reinvent the wheel every time you do it. Use your knowledge and experience to utilize on your projects, you know, to bring the best out of yourself and the catalog. Listing the existing services you have. I've worked on, you know, legacy systems, bringing services onto a new platform, and making sure, you know, what do we need, pulling off reports, for example, and seeing what is actually being used and what isn't, and retiring what isn't. map these to business customers, understand what the actual need is, and then proceed. Classify services according to how they map to the business process is very important in terms of streamlining. Again, something that I've had a lot of experience in, so feel free to reach out if that's your thing. And this is a great start to setting up a service catalog. Okay, these are the benefits of a service catalog. I'm just going to skim through them because I'm just conscious of the time. Sorry. Okay, it helps manage services from business focused and business-based delivery mindset. Allows you to document and manage services from an end-to-end perspective and capture the true cost of service provision. Allowing you to document and manage services from an end-to-end perspective and capture the true cost of service provision. Again, that's a big thing, because for me, that has been the driver in terms of how we bring on new services, for example, and how to reduce cost, as well as can we use an existing bundle, for example, and add some other services onto that. Again, that goes to my Amazon type of approach and thinking right now. It allows you to demonstrate your return on investment to the business customer. So again, a lot of this it comes with experience in terms of how you deliver it and how you propose that to a customer. Demonstrating professional, responsible approach to service management and a business value perspective. And having just structure around what you are delivering is very important, and trying to understand what the actual infrastructure is. That helped me a lot. I went out of my way to understand what the actual business's infrastructure looked like in terms of how I potentially wanted to deliver a catalogue and take that back to the business, because the business can not be as tech savvy as you, or they might be, and they might add their views into it, which you can take into account or not, depending on whether it serves the purpose. And lastly, this whole thing improves awareness and understanding of actual behaviors that make an effective service catalog. And again, I emphasize this time and time again, but as a designer, my big thing is behavior, understanding what people are actually doing in terms of delivering something that's going to be a success. So it's a success factor, I think, understanding what the behaviors are of a user. So it kind of goes into user experience. But again, that's another subject. Iterative improvement and evolution. Start small and then expand. Bring in innovation, include non-direct IT services if you have to, and I'll have to share more on that as well. Solicit often. Asking and obtaining information is a big thing. So again, listening is huge when you're trying to set this up, not just talking and telling them what they should have. It's what would you like, and then meeting in the middle to come out with something as a middle ground in a way, but making sure that it's going to benefit both parties. And lastly, this is my idea of what 5 tips in terms of promoting the service catalog, which is in effect going to be successful, carrying out workshops and having focus groups. I would not ever say do not do that. Make sure the engagement is there from the very beginning. If you engage the people, the senior stakeholders from the very beginning, you are guaranteed success. And that's another point I made earlier. List the dependencies of each service. Make sure the client is aware of what those dependencies are, and you are as a project. The usage parameters, again, I think that is it could leverage how the catalog is actually delivered. Begin with a reasonable number of services, and I did this when I worked in waves. So I worked in 4 waves and deployed something over 3 years. I wasn't being overly ambitious about it. I wanted to do a good job. So breaking it down so you have the time to do it. I hope people have time to work on it and it's not just quick. But yeah, making sure the requirements are there before investigating automation tools, because if you just go in and start faffing around with automation tools, it's possibly going to cause issues. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. Hello?
Yeah, great, thank you. And I saw a battery message just pop up there. I was
I know,
thinking, is
I
that
know.
my battery? No, don't die on me. I need to
It's
host
not.
this.
It's mine. I don't actually think it's plugged in, so I'm just going to quickly plug that in.
All right, you do that. But there are some questions that have come through. Mark and others have been responding in the chat as well. So look, we possibly have a lot of answers, but it'd be good to raise them with you anyway, and also have a discussion. So I'll go for it one by one. So just give me a second. So the first question. And I know it's been covered, but look, just to ask it and verbalize it. So you mentioned a mouse should even be in the service catalog, the service description. And the person was asking whether that was the case. Should hardware be in the catalog? And what's your experiences there? And like I said, it's been answered, but what's your view as to what level of detail you go to in the service catalog?
Okay, so if Mark's answered this one, I'll just add to it. So basically, my experience of a service catalog is how long is a piece of string, right? So I've gone to like the nth degree with this, and I have had service catalogs with hardware and software in them. So for me, absolutely have hardware in there. Why not?
Okay, yeah, and I think it's kind of a given. You and like I said, it's been answered, but you essentially need to have whatever you need to have in the service catalog, so that you know what's useful to your consumers, right? Whatever they're going to call upon.
If it helps, they do draw a distinction between a catalogue of services that IT advertises to customers and consumers, and then a list of things that a customer or consumer can request as part of an Amazon style service catalog. So I see a difference between the two, and I do think there are service levels typically within organisations around how quickly a request will be fulfilled. So request fulfillment is an ITIL process. It's something that many organisations need to manage, whether it be access to applications or access to restricted data areas, or providing a mouse, a monitor, a laptop, or whatever. So I do see that being a service that's required. I do see that being a request that needs to be fulfilled. And whether you have a specific request fulfillment service, or whether you see that as part of a desktop or laptop or other service, completely depends on how it's best structured for the organization. But I do see there being hardware requests being something that can be consumed, but equally a need to cover that as part of one of the services in the service catalog. Now, some people wouldn't have mouse or hardware as a specific service, others would, and it varies. And that's why the great thing about ITIL is it allows you to adapt and adopt. So
I think it's more about business requirements as well. I mean, I've had customers that have said they don't want hardware in a catalog, but then the question is where will this sit? So there's again, the catalog is just a thing. It's a framework, I guess, where you can have something very simple and you can just mature it very quickly if you have to.
Surinder, Simon Purvis. In the service catalogue, then, would you put amount of active users per the service?
Okay, so I have. I'm just thinking of a good way to answer this. There was a whole piece of a project that I did on getting people onto get access to the catalogue in terms of what they could see and what they possibly couldn't see, and that was because of restricted access, as well as where they sat within the business. Yep. I'm going to actually say who the client is here, because it'll probably make a bit more sense. But working with the Ministry of Justice, you can imagine the courts having prisons and courts where you can't just get a printer in, and there's a way to do that, and there would only be someone senior who could potentially order that printer to get that into a prison somewhere random. So in terms of access, I think that's just another piece of work that I did. Access management into a catalogue. it's something that kind of sits ad hoc in my mind. It's not something that.
Oh, but taking your example there, so the Ministry of Justice have got a printer service, not printers, a printer service. Would you have in the catalogue how many printers are in the service?
So if you want to give me a bit more clarity on what you mean by how many printers.
So okay, so let's say there are 15 prisons in the UK.
Yeah.
And each prison has X amount of printers. But in total, in your service catalogue, for the printer service, there are 37 printers out there active.
Okay.
Is that something that you would put in the service catalogue? Because you do your return of investment, etc., against per item.
Yeah, so that's something I have done, working with the vendor on that. It's entirely dependent on what the business is looking for and how much they want to expand. Again, it's very open-ended, Simon, in terms of how I answer this as well, because it comes on the need, whether there's a need for the business to do that. And of course, I deployed a managed print service, so and a bulk print service. So there's a huge demand for printers in the prisons and the courts. So it's entirely dependent on what the customer comes back with. And I keep going back to it being, it's a bespoke approach, and it's not one size fits all, unfortunately. So I can't say, use your numbers and
So
say that.
just a final question then. If I was an incident manager,
Yeah.
I would use the service catalogue to gather a lot of information with regards to that service. And one of the things I would want as an incident manager was to identify the impact. So if that service went down, all those amount of printers would be impacted. Is that something that you would think about for an incident manager, or where would you put that information otherwise?
Okay, so in my experience, that information is always sat with the actual vendor and the incident management team as such. That's not something I would publish in a service catalogue, because the catalogue was only giving me the kind of room to do the delivery aspect of a service catalogue item. So in terms of your incident management, so if it was a printer service that's gone down, so I don't know, printer's gone down at Canary Wharf, I'm just using as an example, that you'd be working with the actual vendor, which I'm not going to mention on this call, but working with the vendor, you'd establish, what the numbers were. It's not something that would be in the catalogue as such. I don't think that's information that would be required, and the end user definitely doesn't need to see any of that, right?
So let me have a stab at answering that. I think it's an interesting question. I have seen organisations that have had a catalogue of services where the criticality of that services is rated and noted as part of the service catalogue. And I think that's part of the answer to your question around how would a major incident manager or incident manager respond, is that would then be managed. And this is where we start to cross into business continuity management and service continuity management, where effectively you'll have a business impact assessment of what if that service is unavailable for a short term or for a longer term.
I hate duplication of work. If your service catalogue can be three-dimensional, i.e. you click on a service, that tells you everything that you require. You can tell the business the impact, you can tell the incident management. If you have duplication, there's room for error.
I agree, and I previously championed in organisations trying to cut down what was originally 3 service catalogues down into 1. But as I think you've heard from Surinder and other examples, there are different organisations that sometimes manage these things in different ways. My view is a service catalogue is a bit like the old Highlander movie. There should be only one. Everybody should refer to it. Everybody should use it, and it should be the single point of reference.
Yeah, and that's just adding on to what Mark has said there, Simon. That's the end goal. So that's the goal I have in mind before I even start getting the business requirements together, and that's part of how it's effective and how it is promoting, success. So that is really important. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, thank you.
So great discussion point. I didn't realize that first question would open up so many different avenues of what a service catalogue could be. I'm not sure if everyone's thinking and questions around that have been answered. So let me just open it up to see if anyone else has a comment, disagrees, or has a subsequent question on what was just said.
So just Debbie here, in my experience with service catalogues, it comes down to customer need. It also comes down to how much the customer's prepared to pay for as well. So I've seen a catalogue where it is just buy a piece of hardware, but then it also feeds to other processes. So that you can have a whole user, it's like a beginners and leavers process where somebody joins the business, they go into the catalogue and it fires off requests to the different areas. So you might have a separate supplier for the laptop, but then you might have somebody else, a different supplier, that sets it all up and gets it all ready. So it links all your services, doesn't it? So you click on your service catalogue and then it fires off links to the other processes. And where you were talking about numbers of printers and stuff, I would have put that under service assets or something like that rather than a catalogue. I mean, that's just my experience.
This is an example of where you will mature over time. So you wouldn't start with a join and move a lever process typically, although many organizations, and it's a common in many of the organizations I've worked in, is that join and move a lever is actually very difficult. When somebody joins, there are so many different processes and so many things that need to be set up. It's actually very hard. So I've seen people that once they've got kind of the basics in place, will then want to progress on to, I want to have a one-stop shop that says I have a new joiner starting next week. Here's the details you need. And that then triggers and fires off initially to all the IT processes, but you can then start to hook in HR and other processes as well.
Yeah. And I've had quite a lengthy experience in terms of setting up joiners and leavers process as well. And I have actually done it, but I wouldn't say it was something that was easy. Like Mark has said, it's very difficult to do that, and to get it set up is a complete nightmare. But it's satisfying as well to know that you know that's something that can be set up within organizations. I can share more detail on that, Debbie, if you really want to, because I have had about 18 months of heartache on that documented.
Yeah, so I've been there at the start. You know, when there wasn't a catalogue, and it's gradually building up. But I think what you said early on is start simply with one thing, get it built up, make sure it works well. Maybe then look at what's your top 5, and like you say, it matures over time, doesn't it? Because some of the processes are simple, some of them are quite complicated.
Yeah.
So let me move us on, just because of time. Because as was said, if anyone wants one-to-one time with Surinder, her Calendly invite details will be sent to you after this session, so you can book one-to-one time with her. You can also reach out to Mark and others through the Slack channel, the mentoring channel. So this requires a deeper conversation, right? But I hope everyone's questions around that were answered, or maybe if time allows, we'll come back to it at the end. So let me just ask another question, if I may. And the question is, how can we differentiate between the business and the technical service catalog? And it ties into, I guess, some of what has been discussed already, but business and service catalog. What's your thoughts there, Surinder?
Okay, so I've had quite a lot of exposure in terms of how, you know, how the link is there. But personally, you know, because you have to think of the service catalog in almost a 3-dimensional mode. So, you know, you've got an idea of how it's going to be deployed, and then the business has an idea, or the client has an idea, and then there's an idea at the end where the end user is sat and how the end user wants to see it. So there's a lot of you know, there's a lot to take in there, but as the service designer in my case, or the SME for the catalog, my job was always to make sure I understood, you know, what the business catalog or the business processes looked like in terms of how the technical catalog stood. And you're almost a go-between to deliver the catalog to you know, the business and the end user. So I don't think the business actually need to understand the technical side of things as much, but or the user definitely doesn't need to understand any of that. But I think as the SME on it, you know, you would have complete control of what's going on, and an understanding, hopefully, to deliver a service catalog which is functional. I hope I've answered that question.
So to the person that asked that question, has that answered your question, or do you have a follow-up? Remember to unmute yourself if you need to. Okay, so or just write here in the chat. So if you don't want to speak up, but you have a subsequent question on that, please raise it in the chat, and I will ask at the end. So let me move on to another question then. Is it good practice to have a service request catalog too, in addition to the service business catalog? So we've already touched on this. Should it be one catalog, or should there be two different catalogs or more? What's your view on that? Perhaps Mark, if you could come in on that one.
My view is the answer is yes. So there was a time, probably pre what many of the processes and tools can now provide us, where a service catalog would have been a list of services that IT provided and the business consumed. You'd have a criticality rating. It would be that single point of reference that we described. You'd have a process to keep it up to date and so on. But I think with the advent of more and more tools, I'm going to keep very tool agnostic in this, the ability to have a list of things that consumers can request. Could be laptops, could be mice, could be access to something and applications and so on. Then having that available in a service portal, maybe on a laptop, maybe on a desktop, now increasingly on a phone, maybe with a chatbot sat alongside it. There's a series of things you can now do to automate that, where effectively you then have a workflow that sits behind that, where you will ask the question. There would then be a series of further things that are required, maybe an approval from someone, either from a line manager for certain types of access, or from a product owner and so on, and a fulfillment would then take place. So there is, in my view, a catalogue of services that IT provides from the supplier to the consumer and customer, and there is then the ability to request those kind of moments of truth where you'd ask for a request for elements of one or more of the services, and then potentially some workflow that sits behind that to fulfill those requests.
Okay. Thank you. Let me move, actually, before I move on to other questions that have come in the chat, let me just open it up to see if there are any other questions, points that people want to make verbally. And remember to unmute yourself if you do. So let me just open it up to see if anyone has a point that they'd like to make based on what you've heard so far, or anything else. Okay, maybe none. So I'll just continue going through the chat questions then. So the next one is, can you also just touch on the difference between the service catalog and service portfolio? Which is a good question, because we're talking about service catalogs, but we know there's more to it. So how does the service catalog link with the service portfolio? Surinder, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, so in my experience in terms of how I've kind of delivered a service catalog is more around the actual services that have been provided me from the customer in terms of what they were on, in terms of their legacy services. So the service portfolio is something I've looked at from my design perspective. So going in from that service strategy and understanding what the service portfolio actually has in it, and then understanding what potentially the service catalog could deliver, but I'm very mindful of keeping the two as separate entities and not getting them crossed, because I think there can be a lot of confusion, because portfolios are tailored to kind of managing services. In my head, a service catalog is just in theory, it's not a standalone thing, but it's just something which it's got everything in it, and it's something that it executes a request fulfillment process from request management. So that's a big difference I see, but I wouldn't and I think the two sit in very different areas in a way. So I tend not to bring the two together in a way as such if I'm delivering a service catalog. But in terms of the service portfolio, would possibly sat with some portfolio manager within the business who's looking at what what services there are. But in terms of how you deliver that from or execute that from a service catalog is entirely one component.
Okay, Thanks, Surinder. Anyone else want to share their experiences around portfolio, the pipeline, and how that translates into a service catalog?
Yeah, sure. I was busy typing away, but if somebody else had a point, then I'm happy to wait for a second.
I've just got a quick view, and I'd just like you to confirm it. So for me, a portfolio was looking about managing all the ITIL services that a client might want. So you might ranging from instant problem, request, all of those different services. So that's your portfolio, and the catalogue to me it's a request fulfillment process, which is for the client users rather than the clients. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's kind of a good point, Debbie, because a service portfolio is essentially there to kind of say this is what we've got. So you've got a pipeline, you've got a catalogue, and you've got possibly things or services that are going to be retired out of the catalogue. They do work together, but again, the portfolio is just giving you a list of what these services actually are, but then actually getting them into the catalogue and making it functional, and then possibly, in my case, I have kind of gone in and seen, okay, we don't need this. It was on a legacy catalogue, retiring it, and then seeing what's in the pipeline. It's a cycle which, is important, and it's good to get kind of hands-on experience of what's in the catalogue or what's in the pipeline. But again, two different things. I'll probably be sat with, in terms of ITIL, I think it'd be sat with two different people as well, unless there's room to maneuver, I guess.
The different functions, aren't they, really?
Yeah.
Debbie, I see it more broadly than just ITIL processes from a service portfolio viewpoint. And I've written a couple of service architectures and service strategies, which very much looked at how service management evolved, but also talked about how other wider trends. So, we'd perhaps talked a few years ago about the move to cloud services and how suppliers will change and what needs to happen there. You might be talking about retiring old infrastructure. You might be talking about the need to bring on new services like self-service and chatbots and so on. So I would see a portfolio being something that's broader than the current service catalogue, and talking about what services and things you want to introduce over the coming period. And it then depends on the planning cycle, whether it's a year or 3 years or 5 years for your organization. And then what you also then want to think about retiring. And that can be at a service level, it can be at a technology level, and it could also be depending on what the business plans are. I've also done, as part of that service strategy, a view on what ITIL
I've lost Mark. Anyone else? Hello, can you hear me? Okay, maybe we're back.
Yep, I can hear fine.
Okay, so I may have had a technical issue on my side. Sorry, apologies, or maybe it was yeah. I was saying, I don't know if you can hear me. It says my internet connection is unstable, but I'll sort that out. So look, we have about 15 minutes and another 5 questions or so. So I'll keep going through these, and more questions are coming in. So we'll have to keep it brief, maybe a couple of minutes on each. And the first one being the KPIs and the metrics used for a service catalog. What are they? Some examples of those. Who would want to pick that up?
Mark, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So as I think I mentioned in the chat, I have a go-to for ITIL metrics, and that is an ITSMF book. I don't earn any commission for this, so I have no problem saying it. There was an ITSMF metrics book that was published a few years ago. I actually needed another copy because mine got lost somewhere. I did manage to find one, but it's not, doesn't seem to be currently published. And it had, for each of the ITIL processes, a list of metrics. And from memory, and it's been a while since I looked at it from a service catalog viewpoint, it included were all the services there, was there feedback from the customer, were all of the attributes for all of the services in place. So it was very much a kind of transactional. Is the service catalog complete? I'd include when it was last refreshed, because in my view, a service catalog needs to be a living document. And so as a result of which, if it's not been updated for 6 months to a year, then I'd say it's out of date. So if somebody would like to contact me offline, I'll have a further mentoring session, then I can certainly check what that book says. But those off the top of my head would be the sorts of metrics that book would talk about.
Great. And you've answered another question by that because someone asked how often should a service catalog be refreshed. So you've answered 2 questions in one. So thanks for that, Mark. And then just one more, I'd add one more KPI or one more metric to that, which I don't think you mentioned, and it's for those services or products on the catalog, how often are they consumed? Because you may choose that if a service is only consumed once a year, perhaps it's still valid to be on that catalog, but maybe it needs to be retired. But obviously it depends on the service. So let me move us on to another question, if I may. So, and by the way, Surinder, some people have asked for examples of service catalogs. Can you show it? But I think we don't have time for that, of course. So if anyone actually wants to see a good example of a service catalog, one that Surinder's built, or example she has, then that's where you message her one-to-one, get in contact with her, and of course with Mark in the Slack channel that we have. So let me move us on to another one. So Surinder, you touched on this earlier, and it's classification of the service catalog items. How do you go about ensuring the right classification for those? How do you actually develop that work with your stakeholders?
Okay, so I'm going to take the word right out, because I don't actually think there's a right or wrong way of doing this. Purely because it's entirely dependent on what the client actually wants to see. Again, goes back to my kind of user experience designer, work I've done outside of work. You need to understand how a customer would like to see it. Again, is it user friendly, and how is the customer navigating through the catalog on the request form page, for example. So I'm then going to flip it back to when I'm sat in a room with the client, and the client is sat there saying, can we have these services bundled, for example? That was one aspect. And then categorizing it in terms of, you've got telephony, then you've got telephony, then you've got voice, and then you've got the various different types of handsets that they can order. That's just one, like your 3-tier navigation there, or 4 even, and then having your printers, and then having your managed print service and your bulk print service. And just picking these off the top of my head, it was so convoluted. These are conversations that you have with the business and the client in terms of how they should be classified for the end user. The only input I actually had from the end user was actually going by their legacy catalog and doing a survey in terms of understanding, in terms of, are you actually happy with the look of this? If you're not, then what can I do to change this? So classification is quite broad in terms of delivering successful classification. I think is important. Understanding what the end user's currently having issues with or isn't happy with, and then going back to the business and saying, can we put these in some kind of navigational category form, so when we're navigating ourselves through to a request, which it's user friendly and it's easy to do. The worst thing you want to do, again, goes back to my point from Tuesday, from a design perspective, is make something or design something which is so convoluted that the user actually gives up midway. And the amount of times I've seen that happen, it frustrates me when I'm navigating myself on a page, and it's like, who designed this is my question. So you want to make it as friendly as possible, and that is engagement with the business and the client, I think.
Thanks, Surinder. And so the next one, there's 2 questions, but I'm going to combine them into one. And they were to do with the process, or just other things that you do around the service catalog. So I'll just read out some of what was asked, but just if you could just answer it as one question, and perhaps I'll direct this towards yourself, Mark. And the question is, when developing a service catalog, do we also look at the process, the retirement of service, ownership of the catalog, the maturity level, the accountability, and the customer's client? So that kind of whole spectrum, rather than just the service catalog where we predominantly focus now. How do you manage the whole entire procedures, etc., of the catalog and ownership?
So I would have I would always say that for every process that you have, there should be a process owner. and I have seen service catalog process owners with a defined process to introduce a new service into the catalog, to update and refine it, and then to retire one out of the end. So I have seen a process owner and a process put in place in organisations to manage that. Whether you would include a specific service to do that on a service catalog very much depends on how you expose the ITIL processes to your customers and consumers. So I think in some organizations you would probably have more of those, and in other organizations they would be part of a wrap or the overall service that's provided and wouldn't necessarily be explicitly included. And again, I come back to the adopt and adapt. It very much depends on what your business is, what the commercial and business relationship is then with IT, and how services provided beyond it, as to what the right approach would be there.
Okay, thank you. And okay, so the next question, again, a couple of questions on this topic, which I'll combine into one, and I'm happy to open it up to others that want to comment or answer it. And it's to do with buy-in and usage of the catalog. So, buy-in of the catalog, the concept, perhaps centralizing the procurement, whereas maybe some people, depending on the organization, country, may rather not go through the service catalog. So buying into the service catalog concept, and then how you increase the usage of the service catalog and people actually using it to order the items or services that they need. Any thoughts on that from anyone on the call in terms of your experiences? Remember to unmute yourself, and if there are none.
One experience I had was where, so I work for an organisation and then moved to IT and then outsourced, so I've seen things from both sides. It's very difficult when a customer or an end user he's used to just picking up the phone. It's so easy, and then of course then the client is then being charged every time they pick up the phone and log a call and whatever. There's extra costs in there. So what they had to do eventually was make it a mandatory process for certain things, that you had to go through the catalogue because they wanted to reduce their costs. And it's just a long-standing thing. So it's a personal thing, isn't it? You've got it's habits and what makes life easier.
Yeah, it's a great point. The last experience I had of self-service and service request was in a professional services organisation. No, I'm not going to say who it was or what market, but I will just say that they had partners within that organisation who very much like being able to pick up the phone and get an instant answer to something. And as a result of which, trying to encourage that organisation to move away from that to self-service had been going for some time and not been particularly successful. And so starting to think about either mandating it. There'd been a huge comms drive to make sure that people were aware of it. There'd been feedback taken on how to improve it and make it more consumable. So there is a lot to do there, but I think it absolutely starts with looking to advertise it more, to promote it more, and then start to think about what it is about the current process that people really like and how to make a new process work. And that's where some of the new facilities that are available through automatic workflows, so something is done instantly 24/7, which might not be the case for all service desks. And also thinking about how chatbot technology can help. Those are the sorts of new functions and features that I think are a real game changer and will make a real difference in the ability to fulfill requests in a different way than picking up the phone and relying on human interaction.
Yeah, and we did do all that. I just didn't touch on it. I was just going from one end to the other, really.
And I mentioned, some people asked for examples of a service catalog, and I said to book some one-to-one time with Surinder because we won't be able to cover it. Then the thought came to my mind, and Surinder mentioned this earlier, I think, in the presentation when she talked about Argos and Amazon. But maybe the person who asked these questions haven't joined yet. So a good example of a service catalog out there that everyone is familiar with is the Amazon interface, as an example. Right, so that is a catalog of services that Amazon wants you to procure. Now, I know the example that perhaps you were looking for when you asked that question was maybe some of the behind the scenes stuff that happens in ServiceNow or BMC Remedy, as was mentioned. So for that level of detail, reach out to Surinder. But yeah, a good example of a service catalog, and they're obviously making billions and billions, is the Amazon front page interface. That's where they've got it right.
If somebody wants more technical kind of back-end work, because I have developed a catalogue as I've been a developer in a catalogue. In one of my previous roles, I can provide that kind of more low-level information if somebody wants that.
Yeah. No. But I guess that's the good point as well, in that someone asked about the business catalog and then the technical catalog. So the business catalog in that example would be, say, the Amazon interface. That's to the clients, to the business, to the customers. But behind that, you can imagine there must be thousands, millions of lines of code and development and all the technical stuff that needs to happen in warehouses to make that possible, to get that to the end user within a day or 5 days, and returns. And anyway, I'm just throwing that out there because we don't have time to go into it in any more detail, but I just hope that will help one or two of you to visualize what's being said anyway. So look, we are nearly out of time. We have time for one more question. We've got a couple of questions still, but our last one. So we've done really well. We've answered the majority of them. And the question was, let me just find it. Okay, yeah. So about translating service portfolios into the service catalog, if they are not used frequently. I guess maybe we've covered this already, but around the portfolio question. So experiences there as to we talked about already. You have the portfolio and you have potential pipeline services in there, and how you manage the transition from the pipeline into the service catalog. And is that manual? And how do you do the selling of that, the promoting of that? Any experiences there that someone, Surinder, Mark, or anyone wants to share, portfolio into service catalog, and how that transition takes place?
So I think you have to see updating the service catalog as one of the many steps you need to manage to introduce a new service or to retire an existing service. So as I think we've talked about in terms of, there was a service design session, you can talk about service transition in greater detail. All of those things need to include, how do we advertise this on the service catalog and how do we manage requests? And that's all part of the broader scheme of things that need to be managed to introduce a new service or to retire an existing one.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Mark. So I think we are done. Any other comments or points anyone wants to mention before I wrap up? Remember to unmute yourself if you need to. I feel like I need to say that each time because you're all very good and on mute. So unmute yourself if you need to. But I think we are good. Great session. Thank you so much, Surinder, Mark, others that contributed, such as Debbie and many of you. So thank you very much. And you will receive an email, an automated email with Surinder's calendar availability. So